You have an incredible story. I could sit here and talk to you, as you know, because every time we get together, I just ask you so many questions. You're just so fascinating, intriguing, and I admire and respect you so much. But I want to share you with all these incredible women here, and also to our women in D.C. who may have questions. So I'd like to open up a little bit so that you all have an opportunity to ask Rose questions to get to know her, as I've had the opportunity to get to know her. Who has a question? Oh, my gosh, everybody. Okay, we'll start with Miss Bailey over here.
你好. Oh.
And to repeat the question, it might be helpful just so everybody hears it, is that the question has to do with the cultural differences. We're becoming a global economy, and how do you incorporate the goal? Because I know you're doing a lot of work. You're now taking people back to China and helping to create that. So how do you address those issues and embrace that?
Well, I think first thing you got to remember, people are people. There is no difference between Chinese people and American people or Germans and Japanese. Human conditions are the same. You have to look beyond the obvious, the language, the bowing, the look to the left, to the right, the seating orders and stuff. Those are all superficial stuff. The same superficial stuff in subcultures as well. My experience, I just started looking at the Chinese market as a business market as opposed to my home country. So up until this point, being a Chinese immigrant doing business in government contracting, I had to overcome my own notions of all the constraints that I have on myself. Even though I speak fluent English, I always perceive other people look at me saying, we can't trust her because she's a Chinese immigrant. That's in my perception. That's not what people say to me, and that's not who I am to them. So I had to overcome that self-restraint, constraint. But what really comes down to the people part, we're really the same. I have clients that telling me, general officers, said, your being Chinese seems to be very, have cultural traits that are very similar to the military. I never heard that before. And then he proceeded to break it down for me, and I said, yes, sir, I can see that now. It's how people relate to each other. So certainly there are specifics, but I think the big piece is mentally, not to think you are so different from them or they're so different from you. They want the same things that you do. They want to make a deal happen. They want to look good in front of their loved ones and people they respect. Those are the fundamental human conditions.
That's great. That's great. Yes, ma'am.
Hi. Good to see you. Oh, my God. That is wow.
So I would love to catch up with you another time and just talk to you about maybe some of the things that I can do to help my daughter. But I read a fascinating book.
Oh, yes. Yeah, that's a great book. Yeah.
That, because I wanted to learn about Kate's homeland and her culture and what the country's been through. And it was fascinating. And I wondered if maybe there were any other books about China that you could recommend.
Yeah, I had finished a book called Chinese Lessons. It's a fabulous book. It's a more contemporary account of what's happened since 1978. So kind of the history I lived through. It was written by, I forgot his last name, John. He's now an editor at Washington Post. He was sent to China to study Chinese and stayed there for 12 years. And he lived through Tiananmen Square, and he was expelled after Tiananmen Square. And then after the diplomatic relation got warmed up again, he got sent back. So I met him in person, and his book was just unbelievable.
We were.
Go back to China now. How do the Chinese authorities?
And the question is, when Rose goes back to China now, how she's treated and how she finds her experience to be. And previous to that, we were talking about books in China, and one of the other ones you mentioned was Wild Swan, which is supposed to be an excellent book, also about China.
Yeah. I suppose you're asking if I was flagged. If I was, I wouldn't know. I don't think I am. So there's no difference how they treat me as other than just another American Chinese coming back. Yeah.
So it's pretty much accepted now that there are American Chinese who come back and are doing work and building relationships with China. It's really very much open now.
It's very much open as long as you keep your mouth shut about certain subjects,
Yeah.
taboo subjects.
Got you. Yes, ma'am.
I'm interested to know if you ever faced some of the issues like being in a male-dominated industry, working in technology all these years, and how you sort of dealt with that and felt comfortable enough to build a pretty substantial business within a male-dominated industry. That fascinates me, so I'd like to know more.
Well, that's a constant theme. I think all of us here see that, and I think you probably have the answer yourself. My experience has been that there are always guys who are interested in me as my merit, so to speak, and they gave me an opportunity. And learning how to communicate with these guys was probably the biggest thing we all had to learn over time. What is the most effective way to communicate with engineers? What is the most effective way to communicate with male managers? What is the most effective way to communicate with male leaders, business leaders, period? So there are different, styles. So I had to learn. So I can give you a quick example. When I worked for my friend in Leesburg, this company in '98, I was a chief architect. I was the only woman there, other than the accountant and the bookkeeper and the administrative person. I was the only woman there. And so I was working with 20-some guys all the time, and there were all sorts of, bathroom jokes all the time going on. I kept to myself. That part was okay. But one of the alpha engineers, he's actually, he loves to argue the point to nth degree. And I usually argue for a while and then just say, it's not interesting, I move on. Until one day he got so annoyed with me and said, I don't understand why you women have you can't just keep arguing. I'm like, wow, that's a big charge. You women? I mean, you're looking at me and you say you women? And so he proceeded to tell me that all his life, including his wife and daughter and his mother, they're all weak debaters. And so he concluded that as women as weak. And then he got frustrated with me because I was, he didn't think I was weak, but I wouldn't debate with him. I would not engage him. So that's when I realized how I was perceived. So when I started working with alpha engineers, usually they're male engineers, I learned to always remember that experience is stay in the debate. The longer I stayed, the more I persisted, the stronger I looked to them. And it was just arguing the point. A lot of times women just like, okay, what's the point in this? Right. The point is to argue the point, to argue.
That's a fascinating lesson. And I'm now recalling incidents where I've had a similar charge or discussion with a male counterpart, and I'm like, you are intractable in your position if you're not going, because arguing to me or debating is the exchange of two different viewpoints to find a place of common interest or commonality and reach a conclusion. If somebody's intractable and trying to get to your side, you say, well, then I don't see why we should engage in that, but the point is the point. Interesting. Christina, and then we'll come over here to you, Junie.
Rose, I understand that you have not used your gender or your race to bid after government contracts. You've gone after the open bid ones. Can you talk a little bit about that and why you took that strategy? And also, I'd like to know why your employees call themselves librarians.
Okay, she wanted to know, number one, why, when she's in government contracting, She is not going after contracts based on her race, her minority status, or her woman-held status, that she goes purely on open source. And the other question was, why do her employees call themselves binarians?
We compete in full and open, that's the term, in full and open competitions because of what we do. That's the main reason. The space that we're in, the capabilities we have, are often associated with much larger companies. And even though we are an 8A certified woman-owned small disadvantaged business, and that's government contracting vernacular for protecting you of certain space or giving you some preferential treatment. I learned early on, and again, it goes back to I learned from a lot of my adversaries. One of them said to me, it was a 3-star general, and said, Rose, I don't care if you're 8A or 9B. If you can't do this, get out of here. And I think that just strengthened my resolve to build the capabilities, to learn to compete, and compete fairly and squarely and smartly. And that's what winning full and open contracts is about, is competing smartly. That's the main reason. Going to why, that's when you ask the second question, it put a big smile on my face. I love this part of leading, of building a corporate culture, building the teams, and growing the leaders. So back in 2006, we had embarked on this rebranding campaign. Actually, before then, before we started the rebranding campaign, we were going through a big spur of growth. And, you know, you can experience this when you grow from a dozen people to 3 dozen people, you can still get to know every one of them. But it suddenly goes to 50, 60 people, and they're scattered at 10 different locations. Suddenly you don't know everybody. So one of my employees suggested that I write a weekly communique to all the employees, and we call it Weekly Highlights. And another employee volunteered and said, I'll write it for you if you just, you know, send me the bullets or talk to me in bullets, and I'll write it for you. So he's a political science major, Big Steve, and he's been with us 3.5 years. So that was 3.5 years ago. And so he took editorial liberty. I had sent him some bullets, and he took editorial liberty and said, instead of my dear fellow employees in binary, he said, that just sounds really bad. How about binarians? And it got stuck. And some of the more mature binarians didn't like it first. Sounds so geeky. We're like a bunch of nerds.
Well, we are, but okay.
But the younger binarians really show them it's fun. It's a, you know, it's a name that we all identify with, and so we all call ourselves binarians. And that's another part of it is when we did the rebranding, we picked purple as our corporate color because our core capabilities spelled to SAGE, strategy, architecture, governance, engineering. And SAGE means wisdom, right? And wisdom is always associated with the color purple in Chinese culture as well as other old world cultures. So we picked, color purple picked a manly purple so everybody can be.
Manly purple. You know, we have manly pink too. So,
yeah.
You know.
So all binarians, they all have, the guys all have a couple of purple ties, and ladies all have something purple, and when they go out, they all know that we're a little bit of purple.
That's awesome. That's great. And what a way to build a culture. Judy, I know you've been dying to ask a question.
I got 2 things. A comment. Actually, purple also works in the government contracting environment because when somebody becomes part of the joint staff, they call them purple suits.
Yep.
So it's very clever as well for that environment. My question is an international one. Over the last, say, 300 years, we've seen the role of Britain change tremendously on the world stage. In the last 100 years, we've seen the role of the United States change tremendously. When is it time for all of us to learn Chinese?
Time is now.
Yeah. So the question is, and I think everybody probably heard you, but when is the time for us to begin learning Chinese and teaching it? And I agree. I think time is now.
This 2008 is launch year for China because of the Olympics. I had just led a not part of, I didn't lead it. I was part of a business trade mission to China in December, and it was an unbelievable experience for me from a businesswoman's perspective. So I think you hear more and more about China. They really want to make a difference on the world stage, and they call that the world stage.
Do you think, I've got a question, do you think we should fear China, or do you think we should embrace China? That's a big question.
That is a big question. You can't afford not to embrace China.
Mm-hmm. I think this was a very important question we needed to ask, and sometimes people don't ask the questions that need to be asked.
I think there's always, keep your friends close and keep your enemies closer. Mm-hmm. If we Americans view China as potential enemy, that's that part of it. But the other part of it is, look at what happened to Africa. When we ignore Africa, all other people see that as strategic potential alliance and make something out of it for their purpose. China, we cannot afford to not embrace China. That's my personal view.
Yeah, that's really well said, and I think we need to be mindful that people are people. We sometimes make a crisis where maybe there doesn't need to be one. I know we have a lot of other questions. Yes, ma'am.
Going with the China thing, do you think the burgeoning economic growth is going to impact political?
Already has.
And the question was, will burgeoning economic growth in China impact the political scene?
Look at Russia. Look at the path Russia took. Exactly, because they didn't go economic growth. They did not fully embrace market economy. They went completely chaotic. Whereas China and India, look at India. When I was in China living in the 80s, I remember we were always worried about half of, my parents, I was very acutely aware of how little money we had. Because, they only made their professor salaries, and most of that money, 50% or more, went into feeding us. And then we talked about the rest of it goes to books and certain things. I got one new set of clothes a year, that kind of stuff. And so I was very acutely aware. When you are so worried about basic living, you don't have time for democracy. That's just not something, Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right? That's the lowest hierarchy of need, is get yourself fed and you have clothed and sheltered. With that, coming with wealth, and then people start getting bored, and intellectual power starts to be released. And I think China has a real opportunity now to become a democracy.
I wanted to call out in D.C. Does anybody have any questions in Washington, D.C.? I'm going to have somebody turn on the mic. Hello, Washington, D.C. Do you have any questions you'd like to ask Rose?
We're enjoying the conversation.
Excellent. All right. No questions. Just sit back and relax and enjoy and drink your coffee, and we'll continue to talk. Yes, ma'am.
I'm Barbara, and I do technical staffing. And traditionally, it is men that I'm placing more than women. What are some ideas you have for getting young women involved in the universities and engineering and getting more women into that career path?
So the question has to do with getting more women into the technical career path.
That's been a battle that's been going on, I think, for 30 years, 20, 30 years. When I was in Silicon Valley, I joined Women in Technology International as part of that. And, unfortunately, we as a country have put so much emphasis on making money and materialistic things. And young girls see that the quicker way to get to that is not through hard working of learning science and engineering and technology. I think organizations like WIT or WITty all have programs to get girls involved in technology early on. That's how I got interested, not just because my parents were engineers and scientists, but I got in, I started programming when I was 13, and it's fun. It's great fun, and you don't realize you're a nerd.
We do. But that's nice to say that, honey. We're going to take 2 more questions because I want to really let people people kind of wrap up, and there's a couple of housekeeping things too as we begin to wrap up. Number one, you have an evaluation sheet. It's really important we get your feedback. It's critical we have your feedback so we can tell Pillsbury how much we appreciate and what the benefit is here for them doing it. And it helps us to make sure we're architecting a program meeting your needs. That's number one. Number two, we're going to want people to stay because we're also going to be interviewing you for your views about what we're doing. So we're going to put it on camera and really own it. So 2 more questions. Heather?
Actually, I'm learning Chinese on and off, and one of the things I'm working on doing is finding creative ways to learn Mandarin. And I read children's books where
Oh,
I
that's
literally
great.
go through and find the part of the character that will translate. Sometimes it takes me 2 hours to find one character. But do you have any advice for people like me who are learning Chinese and trying to remember stroke order and so many of the things that go along with the language?
You want some advice on learning Mandarin? I think it's like a 5-year program. I think you'll never master it.
Actually, I think my strategy would be, if I were you, my strategy would be not to look at the written part. Ignore that completely and just focus on the pronunciations because that is so different. Chinese Mandarin is a tonal language. It's so different from any Romance-based language, anything, Latin-based language. So if you can verbally communicate, and that was taken from my own experience. When I learned English, I never learned how to spell. I didn't learn grammar. I just learned to speak. And you think about it, that's the natural way for kids to learn, right? So then you can converse with people. You get more interested in speaking. And eventually you'll get enough motivation to learn the written part. But that, I wouldn't tackle that just yet. I would go with the speaking part.
So do it conversely. Okay, we had one over here. So the question is, if you're in the contracting space, how do you get out of being a sub and get to be a sole and a prime on a contract?
I think you have to find your niche. You can't be everything to everybody. That is one thing in business I've learned the hard way. When you try to be everything to everybody, you become nothing. People don't remember you. People don't answer your calls because you just sound like every other person they talk to. They don't remember you. You may have a big personality, but that's all they remember. So you have to get your business capabilities very, very focused and say, I'm not going to look at $200 billion worth of procurement. I'm going to only look at $200,000. And because that's one area I can do better than anybody else. And I can do it as a prime.
That is a great way to end this. Rose, you're amazing. Like always, I could sit here and talk to you for 5 more hours. As you know, I always want to. She'll go, let's talk about you. I say, okay, but let's talk about you because your story is so fascinating. You are a fascinating woman. I'm proud to call you a friend. I'm proud that you're Chinese. I'm proud that you're purple. I just think you're an incredible woman, and we thank you for joining us today.
Well, thank you.